I believe in the United States of America as a government of the people, by the people, for the people, whose just powers are derived from the consent of the governed, a democracy in a republic, a sovereign nation of many sovereign states, a perfect union, one and inseparable, established upon those principles of freedom, equality, justice, and humanity, for which American patriots sacrificed their lives and fortunes. I therefore believe it is my duty to my country to love it, to support its Constitution, to obey its laws, to respect its flag, and to defend it against all enemies. Heavenly Father, as we gather here together in this classroom, we ask that you guide our studies and lead us to understanding. We also ask that you protect the individuality of each student as they question and ponder your word in these matters. Thank you, Father, for this beautiful place of learning. We pray these words in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Welcome back to GW Bridge Academy. This is Miss Krewalt, and we're going to continue on in Unit 2, this last lesson, Lesson 5, and we're going to be talking about the Civil War. So this entire lecture will be over the Civil War. All right, we're going to pick up with the very end of the last lecture. Lincoln has just been elected, and remember, he has been campaigning this entire time on anti-slavery rhetoric. He knows that he wants to abolish slavery, but remember, he was trying to come in and grab a lot of support. So his primary focus was the preservation of the Union, and he was looking for ways to do that. But the Southern states, they knew he had in mind to abolish slavery, and they knew that his election was going to be the nail in the coffin for their ability to continue slavery in the South. So South Carolina leads the way, and they vote in their state legislature to secede from the Union. And they encourage other Southern states that are utilizing slavery to do the same as well, and they just start to fall one by one. Their state legislatures vote to secede from the Union. And while this is going on, Lincoln is being inaugurated and coming into power, and his first duty is going to be to have to address the secession of these states. His first challenge is going to be at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, because what's happening there is that South Carolina has taken control of the fort. They have basically surrounded it and are not going to allow any supplies from the Union to come in and supply this fort. As more ships are sent by Lincoln to supply this fort, South Carolina is going to get aggressive about it and start firing on the fort. And basically they're surrounded. They have no other options, and they're going to end up surrendering that fort to South Carolina. So that's going to be the first shots fired in the Civil War. Now, just looking down this timeline, this is in general how this is going to go down. The Confederates are going to have a lot of early victories and look very strong. The Union's going to immediately set up a naval blockade that is going to keep the Southern ships from not only getting supplies from Europe, but from able to trade their cotton with Europe. So this is going to shut down the South economically, and also it's going to starve them out in terms of getting supplies. They are not going to get the military supplies that they need. They're not going to get the food and other things that they might need that they might be getting from Europe, because they can no longer, and they are no longer, trading with the North. Primarily, these early victories are a result of some very weak generals that Lincoln had to kind of cycle through the early part of the war. But he does have a very strong general that was taking up position that he had assigned him on the Mississippi River, because they're going to want to take that river and control it. General Grant is responsible for having taken control of the Mississippi River, and it's going to force the surrender of Vicksburg, Mississippi, which is going to be a huge buoy for the Union. This is a good turning point for them. That was all happening in what is considered the Western theater of the Civil War. In the Eastern theater, or everything that was east of the Appalachian Mountains, that's where these failures of the Union were because of these weak generals. And so General Robert E. Lee is having a lot of success in this area. Because of this frustration, Lincoln is not seeing what he needs to see out of the military in order to advance this ability to abolish slavery. So in 1863, he's just going to make an executive order and just declare the abolition of slavery in the South. And this is what is called the Emancipation Proclamation. He basically just frees all the slaves in the South. Now, understand that that's not going to necessarily happen right away. It's not like these slaves are going to be able to just walk off those plantations and take up their freedom. The South is still at war with the North, so there's not going to be a whole lot of that going on at this moment, but it will come in time. Now, also at this time, I think what Lincoln is probably deciding is that he's got to make a change in strategy. And so he basically says now it's going to be full out total warfare. And total warfare means that some of the general, quote, rules of war are going to be broken. Civilians are going to be involved in this aggressive action. And there's just basically going to be a relentless effort to just beat the South down, and so that they are completely unable to resist anymore. I mean, basically, he's going to engage in very, very heavy, ruthless, aggressive military action. And Grant's going to head up that effort. Lincoln's going to be reelected, and for political purposes, he's going to take on a running mate that's going to be a Democrat. Now, Andrew Johnson was a Democrat, but he also had declared his loyalty to the Union. And so Lincoln felt like when it came time to reconstruct the nation, assuming they'd won the war, that Johnson would be a good ally in that effort to bring the southern states back into the fold. And so this is a strategic move by Lincoln, but it is going to prove to be a bit of a fateful decision, because what's going to happen is that Lincoln's going to be assassinated very soon after this election. And so Andrew Johnson is going to be, of course, the new president after Lincoln's assassination. And so he is going to offer a bit of leniency to the South, and I think a little bit too much in terms of eliminating these leaders that were rebelling against the Union. After Lincoln's reelection, the following spring, General Lee is going to end up surrendering to the Union. Grant's going to have huge success in terms of this new total warfare effort. And the South is going to be suppressed. And finally, they're going to get Lee. I mean, he's like a squirrel. I mean, they just cannot catch him. But finally, they're going to catch him. And that's going to be pretty much the final blow in terms of any kind of ability for the South to resist. The war is not going to officially end, though, until May 26th, where a general surrenders in Texas, in Brownsville, Texas. And of course, we're going to end up with Lincoln's assassination. It was actually a plot to kill several Union government officials, but it only partially succeeds. Lincoln is the only official that is going to lose his life. But all of those that were involved in the plot are going to be found and going to be hanged for their crime. And just a little side note, and I had to learn this very early on because it always sounded so ridiculous. When a person is hung to death, you don't say they're hung or hunged. Okay, you say that they're hanged. It's just one of those things. You hang a picture on a wall and you have hung a picture on a wall. But when it comes to executions of this nature, you say that the people have been hanged, okay, in the past tense, or you hang them in terms of, and this is very morbid, obviously, but just a little grammar there that's a little bit hard to hear, but it is correct that when you refer to an execution by hanging someone from a tree, and it has already been done. Those people have been hanged. Right, let's take this first slide of drawing the lines of geographical war. You should be able to read these maps and understand where the lines of war are actually drawn. It's going to be very important because if you look at the colors on the map, it's very obvious that some of these states are slaveholding states. They're not necessarily in the Confederate States of America. They're not going to be allowed to be there, and we're going to go over that and why that happened. We already talked about Fort Sumter starting this whole effort, but they're going to gain control of the fort and the Union's going to surrender it. But Lincoln is nowhere near done. That was just his first effort to try to get the South to come back on board and at least claim federal property that belonged to the Union. So this is obviously going to fail big time. But now the lines are going to be drawn for war. So other states are seceding. They've created a new government called the Confederate States of America. They have their own constitution. It is more like the Articles of Confederation. It is more of this state sovereignty is more important than the people as a whole having one constitution. It is more heavily favored on each state having its own sovereignty. So that red line you see there is a demarcation of where the southern states fall in terms of the Confederate States of America being its own country now. You've got Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, and North Carolina, and Virginia. Those states are all considered Confederate states now. But as you can see, the gray is showing you that Missouri, Kentucky, and West Virginia, we'll talk about West Virginia because it wasn't a state at the beginning of the war. Those areas are going to be on the side of the Union, or they're going to be a neutral state. And that is because Lincoln's going to come in and basically start some military offensive actions. And the first thing he's going to do is go in and allow a new state to come into the Union. West Virginia had been opposed to joining this effort from the very beginning. So the counties that do not want to be part of the Southern Confederacy are going to gather together and apply for their own statehood as a state called West Virginia. And that doesn't actually come about until 1863, but nevertheless, they're breaking off from this effort. Tennessee is kind of split in the same way as far as the people in those states, but what ends up happening is politically the state legislature is going to be overpowered by those that want to be part of the Confederacy, and they are going to vote to be part of the Confederacy. Now, Kentucky is going to be one of those states where Lincoln is going to go in and offensively position himself to force Kentucky to declare their neutrality. And the reason why he's doing that is because he is thinking ahead. He knows that war is on the horizon, and he knows that the Union will be in an offensive position. They are going to have to physically go down into the South and take back control of those states. So not a lot is going to happen in the North in terms of battles. There's really not going to be any disruption of the North and their economic function. Nothing is really going to happen too much in the North as far as the war is concerned, other than men are going to be taken out of there to go fight the war in the South. But Lincoln knows that he's got geographical issues to deal with here. Kentucky is important because of the Ohio River that flows in its northern border. If it had gone to the South would have had access to that river, and it would have been more difficult to achieve the plan that Lincoln's going to set forward as a military strategy for winning this war. And so this is a very strategic move he makes, and he's very aggressive about forcing Kentucky to declare neutrality. And so he's going to be able to immediately get control of that Ohio River. Missouri is slow in their effort to vote on secession. And of course, they are a slave state. Remember, with the Missouri Compromise, they were brought in as a slave state. So Lincoln's going to send troops into Missouri and prevent them from voting on secession. He's basically going to take control of Missouri politically and militarily to prevent them from slipping over. This, too, is strategic. The lower southern east border of Missouri sits right on the border of the Mississippi River. Lincoln wants control of that Mississippi River because that is going to be extremely important to his military strategy as well. Maryland is another issue, and this is probably the state that gets the heaviest intervention and the heaviest action taken by Lincoln, and some of it being very controversial. But you got to understand what Lincoln's dealing with. He's losing states out of the Union. They are just falling off into the Confederacy. So he's having to be very aggressive, and aggressive in terms of preserving the Union, because Maryland is bordering the Washington, D.C. area. And Virginia, the other border of Washington, D.C., has already slipped over to the Confederate side. So he's going to fight and scratch to hold on to Maryland. He's going to send in troops. He's going to close down any bridges so that no military can cross over. He's going to declare martial law, which is basically military control of the state, particularly around D.C., because he doesn't want any uprising. He doesn't want any problems out of the people that are living in that state. This is a pretty heavy hand. The troops are there to basically prevent any kind of Confederate takeover of Maryland or Washington, D.C. He's also going to suspend habeas corpus, which was a big deal at that time and would be today if that were to happen. Habeas corpus means when you're charged with a crime, you have to be presented before a judge and go through that entire process. It's very important that you have that right, and we talked about that right. You don't want the government to be just rounding up people and arresting them and never charging them with anything, never being brought before a judge and told this is what you've done wrong. If you suspend that, you allow the government to have the control to just arrest and detain people. That was something that was used against them by the British, and that's why it came into the Constitution. And it's part of Article 1, Section 9. It's an individual right, basically, but it's found in Section 9 of Article 1. And it reads that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless, when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. So here was the caveat. Here was that edge that he had in the Constitution. He knew that Constitution inside and out, and he knew he had this ability to make an exception to the right of habeas corpus. So if there was a rebellion in Maryland, as far as the Confederate sympathizers there wanting to take control of Maryland and then get control of Washington, D.C., that was considered rebellion. The Confederacy seceding was rebellion. And so Lincoln was, I believe, very justified in this action that he takes to suspend habeas corpus, because that, together with martial law, was going to make it impossible for anyone there to take control without having to go through the military and without having to process all these people. And that would have really backlogged the courts to try to get all these people in that are rebelling. They're almost guaranteed to rebel. They were a slave state and considered themselves Confederate sympathizers. So that's going to be probably the most aggressive action that Lincoln takes, but it's very, very controversial. So just know that in Article 1, Section 9, this Clause 2 that I have in the red box, that's the constitutional substantiation. That's the constitutional reason why Lincoln does this. So when someone says, well, he suspended habeas corpus and, we have that privilege, we have that right as individuals, that's the argument. But look at what the Constitution says. If there is a case of rebellion, that's going to be widespread. You cannot process a bunch of people through the courts in that situation. It's just not feasible. You have too much chaos, and the courts are not going to be able to function. So it's controversial, But nevertheless, this is what Lincoln does, and he's able to preserve Maryland in the Union. All right, so there you go. That's the lines of war being drawn. You're going to see that even though they're Southern slaveholding states, those states are going to remain either neutral or controlled long enough to allow the Union to get their troops across and into the Confederate States. And remember that the territories are not voting on secession. They're not really able to do any of those things. They're not set up for that, and they're not going to be considered Confederate or Union. They're just not going to be considered that for this war. But Oregon and California are free states, and they are going to be considered part of the Union. Okay, let's take a look at the political lines that are being drawn. And that basically is referring to how is the governmental system set up during this war. Well, you know that in the South, they had already created their own government. They gathered together, drew up their own constitution, and created a government. And it is called the Confederate States of America. So that's its official name as a government and as a, quote, nation. So looking over here, you've got a government in the North, the Union, which is basically the United States government, and the president is Abraham Lincoln, so technically he's the president of the Union. And over here on the right, the southern states that had seceded formed their new government, and they elected Jefferson Davis to be their president. Now, when it comes to their positions that they take on this war, these are my words, and so I just want you to know that's where that's coming from. But it is my opinion that the North takes the moral high ground here. Lincoln had been using this rhetoric since the debates he was making with Stephen Douglas. Okay, so he has honed this argument this entire time, and I believe it is a good and righteous moral position to take. And so, in my opinion, they have the moral high ground. There is just no way to say you're supporting states' rights, but you're doing it in an effort to protect something that is extremely immoral. And so this is where things get a little hazy when it comes to governments. You can call a government anything. You can call it a republic, a democracy, or whatever. But if they're not operating in a moral manner, using a legal system like the Constitution that was built on moral principles, unless you have that, you can call it whatever you want. But it's not going to be a constitutional republic. It's not going to be morally driven law or country. I'm making that opinionated statement because I believe the South used the states' rights, which is important. States' rights are important. But what the South has done here is that they're using good theory. They're using John Locke's social contract theory, where he says that you can break up a government or break away from a government and break a contract with other people in society if you feel like what's happening with the government that you've set up is that it's abusing the people. Okay, so it's a breakable contract. And that's what they're going to use for their defense. But it's very sketchy because what they're doing is they're saying, you're not letting us expand slavery into the territories where, they were trying to contain it in the states, and the government was allowing them to do that. Remember, there were all these compromises that were made, but over this time, they're trying to break out of that. And finally, once the Democrats had had the majority of the power in the presidency and in the Congress, they were able to push that law and that slavery into the territories. And this is what tipped the scales. So they're still pleading this as they go through secession. And they're saying this war is about states' rights. But that's a sketchy defense. You're basically saying the states' rights to abuse the individual. Okay, you're to enslave the individual. There is just something morally wrong with that. And Lincoln knows this. Of course he understands this. And so he's in direct contrast to the southern states that have done this. So In my opinion, you're basing it off of something extremely immoral. The North is going to take a righteous indignation to say what you're doing is wrong, and now you've stepped over the line with it, and now we're going to go to war if that's what it takes. So, when you're looking at these things, sometimes they don't get in and talk about the morality of it. It's not very popular right now to talk about morality when it comes to important issues in the nation. But if you look at the way the Civil War was coming about, it was over this moral issue. It's okay to talk about morality. It's important to talk about morality. And so, like Lincoln, don't be afraid to speak out and say, this is wrong. This goes against everything our nation was founded on. It's okay to do that. You're going to get a lot of blowback. Okay, you're going to get a lot of screeching and hollering and violent response. But nevertheless, the right thing to do is to correct the situation and not allow immorality to continue to happen. I think it's very important to be talked about right now in the way things are being handled in America. There is so much violence that opposes people who are trying to have the moral high ground. And it's okay. Stand your ground. When it comes down to it and you're trying to preserve this union, stand your moral high ground. Okay, that's what Lincoln did, and it hurt. We went through the entire Civil War, but it was the right thing to do. All right, getting down to these politics. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. He was the first Republican president that America had. President Jefferson Davis was a Democrat in the South. In the North, you had an established government structure. We had already had the Constitution. It had been tested. This is going to be a huge test of the Constitution, the Civil War. But in the South, they had just set up their government structure. And so it was in its infant stages trying to develop. And also they had a constitution, but it had been untested constitution. It had just been presented and, it hadn't had a chance to really work itself out. In the North, we had already had, as a nation, the United States and its government established ties with European nations. Okay, and this Emancipation Proclamation is basically going to be an abolition of slavery by Lincoln. In the South, they're trying to seek the help, aid, and recognition of European countries of the Confederate States of America as a nation. Okay, but this is so futile because they were seeking this primarily from the British. But the British had already abolished slavery in 1833. So it's going to be very difficult for them to side with the South because then they would have been endorsing slavery, and that was completely counter to their culture at this time. Probably what they're holding on to is that they were enjoying this economic trade that they were making with the South that was beneficial to the British people to have this exchange going on with the southern states. But they're never going to get that recognition from Britain. In the North, Lincoln's going to be reelected in 1864, and he's going to choose a Democrat as his VP, as his vice president. And this was the custom at the time. So Andrew Johnson was Lincoln's strategic choice to get someone as his VP that would help kind of bring the South back into the fold of the Union. And Johnson was loyal to the Union, even though he was a Democrat from a southern state. He was loyal to the Union. This ticket of Lincoln and Johnson is going to prove to be fateful, however, because Lincoln's going to be assassinated. He's going to be killed by a Southern sympathizer. And therefore, Andrew Johnson is going to move up into the seat of the president. And he's going to have to be the one that deals with the reconstruction of the nation after the war. What's going to happen is that Johnson's going to be a little bit more sympathetic to the South and to the Democrats in the South. And he's going to be particularly sympathetic to the leaders, the political leaders of the South. And so what happens is all of the Confederate officials are going to be pardoned. The military leaders, the political leaders are going to be pardoned for their, quote, crimes committed during the Civil War. And President Andrew Jackson is going to do this using the authority given to him by Article 2, Section 2. So if we look at that right quick, I'll just read it to you. This is in Article 2, which is the executive branch, which basically sets up the president and the vice president's office. In Section 2, it says the president shall be the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into actual service of the United States. He may require the opinion in writing of the principal officers of each of the executive departments upon any subject relating to the duties of their respective offices. And this next part is what's important. He has these other explicit expressed powers. So with regard to pardoning the political and military leaders of the Confederacy, the President of the United States, and that's what this is regarding, he shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. So for any charge, for any offense, for any criminal offense, a president can grant a reprieve or a pardon. In other words, you're not going to be further charged for those things. Your trial's going to stop, or you're not going to be tried for those offenses anymore. You're basically given your freedom by the President of the United States. He has, or she has, that ability to do that in the United States Constitution. So what Johnson does is completely constitutionally legal. In 1868, he's going to grant those pardons, and Jefferson Davis is going to go free and be able to live out the rest of his life peacefully on his own property and free. Whereas, think about what happened on the other side here. Lincoln's going to get a bullet to the back of the head. It's an unfortunate outcome to the war. I just think it's a very sad state of affairs to look at what's happened, to know that Lincoln took the high moral ground, but he suffers the highest consequence for it. Whereas in the South, crimes are being committed against the Constitution. All men are created equal. That is what the Declaration of Independence says. But the South, the Confederacy, goes absolutely contrary to this very moral, ethical basis of the law of the United States. But the president of this new Confederate nation that was created based on the abilities of the South to engage in this immoral slave behavior, that leader is going to get away with his freedom and comfort for the rest of his life. I just think that the outcomes of these two leaders is extremely significant in history. Okay, also what you should be aware of is that when you have something ingrained in a culture, something like this tradition of slavery in the South, it's very, very difficult for the people to make this immediate change. And they're going to be resistant to allowing the slaves to have their freedom. And this is extremely unfortunate because literally it's going to take another 100 years for the former Confederate states to give up this discrimination and this abuse and the inequality at which they're treating Black Americans. The South is going to resist any emancipation of these slaves. And so what they're going to do is they're just going to replace the law with their own laws and their own codes they set up in their own states. So they're going to reverse the peace agreements and revoke laws, and they're going to issue black codes, which this is a precursor to basically Jim Crow laws that are going to come later on. It's going to take another 100 years to get rid of all these trashy legislations that keep blacks from having equal rights. So they're going to issue these black codes, and of course black codes are going to be violations of the civil rights that every individual, that every citizen of the United States has. And it's going to be a violation that is focused on who's of what race. The Black American race, African American race, you're not going to get certain rights, and you are not going to be on equal standing with other people in the community. That's kind of basically how these black codes are going to work out. And they're going to be very severe. I mean, most of these Black Americans are going to essentially be in slavery still for a lot of years to come. All right, y'all go ahead and take a break. It's already been about 40 minutes, and this is going to be a long lecture. It's going to be broken up into hopefully, just these 2 sections, but the next section is probably going to be just as long. All right, welcome back, and let's get right back into the Civil War. And we're going to move on from all this political nonsense and get right down to the military strategy that's going to be put in place to conduct this war. You don't just send out troops. Typically, the president is going to gather together his War Department, and they're going to come up with a plan of how all of this military operation is going to come about. What's the best strategy, and where do we put people? Where do I put leaders? Where do I put troops? And how do we proceed to accomplish our goals that we're setting forward? The North is in a purely offensive position. They have to go somewhere and do something. They just can't stay where they are, because the Confederacy is just going to continue on with their plan to rebel and create their own nation right next to the United States, or what's left of the United States. So the South is purely on defense. They're basically, someone's got to come stop them from what they're doing. That is really how it's all going to go down, unless the North sends troops and tries to take back control of these Confederate states. So that when I say that they're purely on an offensive position, I mean, if you play any kind of sports, you're the one trying to make the goal, trying to make the points, okay? And they're going to have to go on the move to do that. There are very few battlefields that are in Northern Territory or in Union Territory. The highest the South or the Confederacy is going to get under General Lee is going to be Gettysburg. That's what they call the high water mark. But other than that, the North is completely free to continue about their business. Now, they're going to lose laborers. Obviously, soldiers are going to be conscripted into the Union Army and be forced into military service. That's something that is going to happen during the Civil War. They're going to be basically forced into serving in the military for the Civil War. And that's going to be men between the ages of 20 and 45 in the North. But other than losing those laborers, the economy in the North is not going to be affected very much, nor is everyday life. You're not going to have war at the door or in your backyard. It's just not going to happen anywhere up there, and they're able to continue and thrive economically in the North. So you got to remember that, because when this war is over, the South is not just going to be beaten politically in terms of having to give up their slavery. They're going to be suffering from wars and battlefields that are all over the southern states. So that is going to play into how these two parts of the country are going to fare after the war when it comes to their economic stability. So the North is going to take the troops and leave the northern area and go into the South. What Union General Winfield Scott has set up is this plan called the Anaconda Plan. And basically, it's this encircling of the South and the siphoning off of its oxygen. That's what an anaconda would do. And of course, an anaconda is from the boa constrictor family, and it's a snake that is not venomous, but will capture its prey and squeeze it to death. I mean, that's how they kill their prey. So Scott's plan, his offensive plan, is to go in, encircle the South, and cut off its military and food supply so that it basically has to surrender up its territory. When you run out of supplies, you just can't function. I mean, you've got to have supplies coming in constantly to feed this military action. And once you cut it off, it's just a matter of time when ammunition and food supplies run out, and you just simply have to surrender or be taken over by the enemy. Okay, so in the North, remember that Lincoln has already fought for political control of the Ohio River by making sure that Kentucky was going to take a neutral position in the war. So he's got control of the Ohio River. That's that upper arrow right there that's running over Kentucky. The plan that Scott comes up with, this Anaconda plan, is basically going to start with they're going to set up a naval blockade all along the southern border up until it gets almost nearly to Philadelphia. And it's going to go all the way down into the tip of Texas. There's going to be a naval blockade that is going to try to prevent the South from continuing their shipping into Europe and getting those supplies back from Europe. So that's the first thing they're going to do, is cut off this outlet to the Atlantic Ocean. Secondly, they're going to divide in order to conquer the South. And what they're going to do is make a couple of strategic moves that they feel like will be effective in separating the states. Basically, you're trying to separate the states out so that you can conquer them in small groups. And they're going to do this by taking a geographical feature that they can use for transportation and use that as their cutoff point. And they're going to do that with the Mississippi River. And that's why Missouri was so important, that it didn't slip over into the Confederacy, because that's going to give them their northern access to the Mississippi River. And so the Mississippi River is going to run from Missouri all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And they're going to basically be able to cut off any supplies or troops coming in from Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas. That's going to be a huge loss for the supply chain coming into the South. The Union is also going to try to cut a line across the rest of these Confederate states, like right there through Tennessee and Georgia. And so you're going to see this line of battles develop all the way from these borders all the way down to the Atlantic Ocean, because, again, they're trying to cut off part of these Confederate states, take them as groups, and keep them away from each other, keep them from supplying each other, and just basically starve them out. And lastly, they're trying to deal with these capitals. This new capital in Virginia, that is the Confederate States of America's capital. And then, of course, to preserve the Union's capital, or the United States capital, at Washington, D.C. Now, we talked about these weak generals that Lincoln had. What would happen is they would go in and these battles would begin. And General Lee was very good about evading them. So he would engage in battle with them and then have to retreat. But then they wouldn't pursue this Confederate general after he started retreating. And so he would be able to muster up another assault on them. And so this was a constant failure of these generals that are going to be in these areas that are on the eastern side of the Confederacy. It seems to me that these generals are having a hard time with this war on a psychological basis. They know these other generals that are now supporting the Confederacy. And so it's really, this war is so psychologically disturbing for them, because you're fighting brother against brother. They know these people, and some of these soldiers are their relatives. And a lot of these generals may have been their friends before. And so this was probably a very difficult psychological barrier to overcome for these Union generals. But nonetheless, it is going to delay the end of this war because these generals are going to be weak in their pursuit of the Confederacy, and they're going to hesitate multiple times, and Lincoln's going to go through like 5 generals before he finally gets one who's going to completely suppress the Confederacy. In the South, remember, they're just defending their territory. If they can just hold their ground and, wait for the Union to give out on their efforts to take control, then they'll have won the war. They don't necessarily have an offensive tactic. They're just basically trying to preserve themselves as a new nation, as the Confederacy. Now, in order to deal with the naval blockade along the coast, they developed these great ships that are shallow draft ships. That means they can run in very shallow areas along the shoreline. And so the larger ships that are providing the naval blockade, they can't come in that deep, because they're going to run aground and it's going to ruin the ship. So what happens is the South is going to make these little blockade runners, and you can see a picture of it down there by the picture of General Lee. And half of these things are going to get through and be able to make these supply runs to the southern ships that are making trips back and forth to Europe. So what happens is they get as far as the blockade, and then these blockade runners run through the blockade and collect the supplies and go back. As far as a blockade, it's effective, but the South is finding ways to evade them. They make 8,500 evasions through this blockade. Also, the South is going to benefit from just superior military leadership. There's a lot of West Point graduates, a lot of Mexican War veterans that are going to come into play here, and they're very strategic. And General Lee is one of these really good generals that somehow manages to break all the military strategy rules, but it works for this war. And so that's going to be a huge benefit for the South. They're going to recruit into the Army men that are 18 to 35 years old. Now, just like the North was offering a way to get out of this. If you had enough money, like $300 was their cutoff. If you could pay $300, you could be exempted. But in the South, the exemption was that this, very poorly named 20 Negro law. And basically what that meant was that if you owned 20 slaves and you were overseeing those slaves, then you could be exempted from military action. Because basically they did need these plantations to continue to produce. Because if they didn't, they would not have the supplies they needed for this war, especially the food supplies. Okay, let's take this map of America. And as you can see, now we're dealing with a lot bigger portion of the American country as we know it now. So I've slid the map over, and we're going to discuss how the war in these battles are going to develop. And I'm not going to go over, obviously, all the battles. There's just way too many to go into this one lecture. But I'm going to try to cover all of the major ones so you can kind of see how the war is going to make a shift at a certain point, and the Union is going to gain the upper hand. So what we have right now is you can see that this red line along here shows the border of the Confederate States. And the capital for the Union is going to remain the capital of the United States, which was Washington, D.C. And Richmond, Virginia is going to be chosen as the Confederate capital. And I have no idea why they would choose Richmond, which is so close to the border. I just think that was very risky, and it was probably difficult to defend that. Nevertheless, that's what's happening here. This brown line that runs along, that's that Appalachian chain I'm trying to signify with just a simple straight line. The Appalachian mountain chain is going to separate this war into a Western theater and an Eastern theater. So everything along that eastern seaboard, Atlantic seaboard, is considered the Eastern theater battles. And everything on the western side is going to be considered the Western theater. And of course, the strategic geographic element here is the Mississippi River. Lincoln is going to use that Ohio River where it's connected to the Mississippi River, and he's got a geographical feature that he can now use to siphon off the Confederate states. If you take a bird's eye view of this, and that's what we're doing essentially here, is looking at this map, there's a water boundary encircling the South now. And so what's happening is this is becoming as much of a naval effort as it is an army effort. They're definitely employing all their resources that they have with them to come in and offensively try to take back the South. And I think this is a brilliant plan. I mean, it's going to work is what's going to happen. All right, so let's just go through it. Basically, the goals for the Confederacy is to just defend its territory. All they have to do is defend this territory and hold out as long as the Union is willing to fight. But, of course, the Union goals are much more extensive. And they're going to have this, basically, they already have control of the Ohio River. They're going to take control of this Mississippi River that's running north and south and separating off Arkansas and Louisiana and Texas. And then they're going to try to cut right through the middle of the remainder of the Confederate states. They're going to go, that's going to be through Tennessee. There are a lot of battles fought there before they get to Georgia. And once they get to Georgia, Sherman's just going to burn a path all the way through Georgia and destroy everything in his path until he gets to the Atlantic Ocean. So that's going to happen. And then, of course, Richmond is going to be needed to be taken over. They're going to need to take that political leadership out through taking control of the Confederate capital. And of course, this blockade is providing that encircled naval effort that's going to be used by the Union. And remember, the Union has control of these forces now. They had control of the naval forces. They're going to use the Navy to provide a blockade along this entire coastline of the South. Then, of course, I've just labeled here that the Western Theater is on the west side of the Appalachian Mountains and is going to run all the way into Texas. And the Eastern Theater is going to be on the east side of the Appalachian Mountains, running towards the eastern seaboard of the Atlantic Ocean. Of course, the first major battle is going to be the fight over Fort Sumter, and that's not going to be much of a battle. I mean, a few shots are going to get fired, and the Union is going to surrender Fort Sumter. But as a result of this, Lincoln is going to make sure that this naval blockade is set up, and you can see along here that it's indicated by these little ships. It's going to run all the way from nearly New Jersey all the way down around the southern tip of Florida and down to the very tip of Texas. They're going to keep this blockade up the entire time, and it's extremely effective. Now, the Confederacy is going to have a pretty good start to this war. They're going to be pretty successful in their early battles. And up in Bull Run, they're going to win both of those battles. And this is going to be a failure on a part of the Union generals. And so we're not going to get into all those details because we would just spend, 3 weeks on it. But basically, these Union generals are failing when they're encountering Lee, and they're having to be replaced by Lincoln. Grant, General Ulysses S. Grant, is going to gain control over this upper part of the Mississippi River. And down from the south, from the port of New Orleans, Admiral David Farragut is going to gain control of the lower part of the Mississippi. And eventually, they're going to have control, much like this blockade, over the entire length of the Mississippi from Missouri all the way down to New Orleans. Now, what this effectively does is cut off any supply lines, any troops, any movement coming across the Mississippi River into the Confederacy by Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana. And of course, you're not going to see or hear about too many battles that happen in these areas because basically they kind of got cut out of the battles early on in the Civil War. So this is going to happen in 1862. The control of the Mississippi is going to lead to a very big and destructive battle in Vicksburg, Mississippi. And basically, what the Union's going to do is they're just going to encircle Vicksburg and just wait for them to get starved out. They literally are just waiting for them to surrender, because although they're going to have battle there, the major point is to just get them to run out of supplies. They've been cut off now, and they're not going to be able to sustain this battle for very long. Now, the Vicksburg battle is a pretty important win for the Union, but at the same time, over in the Eastern Theater, we were just talking about the Western Theater and this whole effort to get rid of those states west of the Mississippi and take control of the Mississippi. But at the same time, over in the Eastern Theater, you still have these failures of these generals, and they're going to lose a lot of ground here. Antietam, Maryland, that is going to go to down on the Confederate side as a victory. Fredericksburg is going to come down as a victory. Chancellorsville is going to come down as a victory. And these are all happening at the same time that successes are being made over here by the Union on the Western Theater of the war. So you have failure over here on the Eastern Theater and some success over here on the Western Theater. But eventually they're going to catch up to each other. The Battle of Antietam in Maryland is going to be pretty significant, because what's going to happen here is it's really kind of a stalemate. It's basically just a very weak victory for the Confederacy. So Lincoln's going to use this moment to decide to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And of course, this is going to be like a political move that's going to try to, again, undermine the Confederacy. And he's going to basically say and get word down there that every slave in the Southern Confederate States is going to be set free. Now remember, that's not going to necessarily happen very quickly, but nonetheless, this is going to be a psychological way to subdue the South yet again. General Lee is going to advance as far as Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in 1863. And even though this is considered a Union victory, it was a very bloody and costly battle, and just going to weaken both sides just in the nature of how many lives are lost at this battle. This battle is going to be a turning point for the Union, but it's going to be a very costly one at the same time. And again, remember that this is Lee's high water mark. This is as high as the Confederacy is going to get in terms of gaining advancement into the Union territory. Remember, he's trying to get control of the Washington, D.C. area. So these are highly contested battles over here, trying to get in and control the political ground of the Union, which is Washington, D.C. Gettysburg for Lee is just an opportunity to try to throw some of this misery into the North and get the North, as far as a psychological loss for the North. He feels like if he can penetrate as far north as Pennsylvania and create chaos there, then he's going to start to intimidate the North and make them feel what it's like to be a nation in the midst of war. And again, so kind of like a psychological attack for Lee to go up there and have this battle in Gettysburg. Basically, the Union win at Gettysburg is going to encourage Lincoln to really step on the gas with this war and with this aggressive offensive military strategy. And he finds a general that's willing to fight, and that's exactly what he says. Grant fights. This man fights. And he's going to use Grant to basically take over this new effort of total warfare. And we talked about that a little bit in the beginning. And total warfare is basically you are leaving nothing for the enemy troops to utilize after you've gone through a specific area of the geography. You are going through and stealing whatever you can out of civilians' homes. If the civilians resist, they're going to be killed. And using everything that they have, the food that's on their in their fields, the animals that are on their property, any supplies that they have on their property. There is no more distinction between military targets and civilian target. And so Grant is willing to take up this sort of military action, and this is exactly what he does, and it's very ruthless. And he gets a lot of names like Unconditional Grant and Butcher Grant because of this action, because Lincoln and his generals have decided this is the only way we can force the end of this war, and that is being extremely ruthless in destroying the South all the way down to the ground. I mean, they literally are going to burn Georgia to the ground in order to achieve this goal. So they have fought their way through Tennessee, and they're going to end up taking control in Georgia. So, but in the Shenandoah Valley, where that's primarily where Lee is getting his food, okay? He's eating out of that valley. He's going back and resupplying and back and resupplying. They know that, and they go in and they burn all that stuff to the ground. And they have basically burned Lee's breadbasket. That's going to break him basically in the end, because this is a geographic area that he's in, and that's where he goes to resupply. And there are no helicopters. There are no major air supplies that can come in and resupply Lee's army. So this is going to be a major blow to the Confederacy. These battles in Tennessee that are basically a march into Georgia, there's going to be Shiloh, Chickamauga, Chattanooga, Tennessee. These battles are basically going to be the ones that lead up to and make that line. Remember that line that's running right through the middle of those states. They're going to try to divide these states through Tennessee and through Georgia. All right, and pretty much the memorable event that is representative of this total war strategy is going to be Sherman's march to the sea. He starts in Atlanta, burns down Atlanta, completely destroys this city, this Southern Confederate city, which was a huge railroad hub for the South. Okay, so the Confederacy is going to lose that transportation connection. And so burn Atlanta to the ground and then start marching all the way to Savannah. And all along the way, he's either going to take control of livestock or kill it. And so there won't be anything left for the Confederacy to use. Any fields, take the food. What you can't take, you burn the rest of it. Civilians' homes are burned to the ground. They take what they want out of them and burn those houses to the ground. And he makes this path of destruction all the way from Atlanta to the eastern seaboard, the port of Savannah. Okay, number 10, move north a little bit. After they destroy the breadbasket, basically what they're going to do is that they are going to have like an entire year of battles happening in this place called the Wilderness, and that's in 1864. And this is just going to further weaken the Confederacy in this area. And what's going to happen is Lee's going to end up surrendering at Appomattox, Virginia. That's going to be the end of his run of Confederate victories. Basically, this is the most important surrender that happens. Nevertheless, the official end of the war is going to be the surrender of General Smith, and he's going to surrender at the Battle of Palmito Ranch down in Brownsville, Texas. So that's going to happen on May 26th, 1865, and it's considered the last official battle of the Civil War. So that's just a very brief rundown of the Civil War and how it developed as initially a surge by the South, a lot of wins there. But once the Union gains control of the Mississippi River, it starts to turn in their favor. They control that Western theater, and now they're going to start marching over and taking care of Lee in the Eastern theater up in Virginia, and basically just use brute force to take down Georgia and split the Confederacy, what's left of it, in half. And that's really how they continue to get their wins, is on that track that they take right down the middle of the Confederacy. Okay, let's just go over some of these generals that were fighting in the Civil War. There are so many, and I really just can't do them all justice by any stretch of the means. So let's just go over the ones that are probably the most well known. And we're going to start with General Ulysses S. Grant. I'm going to post that video of him. And he's basically working in the Western Theater. At the beginning of the war, he was assigned to take control of the upper Mississippi River. And he's very successful at doing this. And as a result of that success, Lincoln asked him to start this new total warfare policy. And he's going to embrace it. He's going to be willing to do it. He's not going to be like the other Union generals and kind of back off and be weak about their aggression. He's willing to take full aggressive control of the South at this point, and he's very successful in doing that. Note that definition, total warfare. Sometimes there are rules of war that are set, and those are going to be broken. They're going to be disregarded. Civilian targets are going to be places to attack and to destroy, and property is going to be destroyed as much as possible. Any kind of infrastructure, railroads, telegraph lines, those are all going to be destroyed. Grant's going to be very successful in doing this, and eventually he's going to become the 18th President of the United States. General William T. Sherman is also working in the Western Theater, and he is going to be promoted to general after his combat at Bull Run. He's going to get that big Union win in Shiloh and Chattanooga, Tennessee. And his scorched earth policy, which is basically the embracing of this total warfare, is that march to the sea. He's going to burn down any resources the enemy might have. And this is going to be basically the destruction of Georgia as a state. And Sherman is also coined as having said the phrase, war is hell. And it certainly is. If you're going to be a general willing to take on this type of total warfare, you can't be compassionate in too many ways, because you're never going to achieve the goal. And he takes on this assignment, but he knows what he's doing. He knows these are his own brothers. These are fellow Americans, and he's having to go through and create hell. But it is going to prove to be the blow that's going to break up the Civil War and basically put an end to it. General Robert E. Lee is a Confederate general, and I put a video up there about him, an interesting one where an actor is basically playing his part and talking about his biography. And he's, of course, in the Eastern Theater, and he has so many victories here. Primarily starting out getting those huge victories at the battles of Bull Run. And he has this habit of splitting up his troops with just very ill-advised military strategy, because you never want to weaken your forces. And if you split them up, you divide and conquer, they can be conquered very easily. But somehow he's able to do this and make it work in the campaigns that he's running up in Virginia and Maryland. And so Chancellorsville, Virginia is going to be Lee's finest victory. That's where he's going to have the memorable victory. But it's going to be extremely costly, because he's going to lose what he calls his right arm, which is General Stonewall Jackson, who is also, of course, fighting in the Eastern Theater with Lee. Stonewall Jackson becomes Lee's right arm, so to speak, because he's just such a dutiful soldier. And he does what Lee needs to do to be successful. So Lee's not making all of these victories on his own. He just has really good military leadership under him. And Stonewall Jackson was certainly one of those brilliant leaders that had very high success with the troops that he ran and things that he would do to support Lee's actions. But this battle that's considered Lee's finest is very costly because he's going to lose Stonewall Jackson in this battle. He's mortally wounded. He's going to lose his left arm. And Lee is telling him, I don't care. You get better. I know you've lost your left arm, but you're my right arm. That's what he's saying. He basically sends that message. Get back out on the battlefield. I need you. You're my right arm in these battles. But that's not going to happen. Stonewall Jackson's going to lose his life, and it's going to be in a very unfortunate manner. He's going to get shot by friendly fire, which is basically getting shot by your own troops. Jackson had gone on a scouting mission, and him and his soldiers are mistaken for being Union soldiers, and so the Confederacy fires upon them, and he's actually killed by his own Confederate soldiers. So the whole death of Jackson has got to be, a really big blow to Lee, especially psychologically, because Jackson was dutiful. He was known for his extreme spirituality, about his faithfulness to this war effort, and spiritual in a Christian manner. He was a very spiritual person and felt very righteously indignant about what he was doing. And so losing Stonewall Jackson is going to be a big blow to the Confederacy. All right, let's take a quick look at these wartime innovations, and then we're going to wrap it up. The Civil War is considered the first modern war, and that's because the weaponry and the military strategy, the tactical systems at which they use, have not really changed too much since this war. They have access now to railroad transportation, which is a lot faster than moving heavy equipment by horse and buggy and wagon. Okay, that's going to improve it dramatically, especially for the North, because they have most of this transportation system set up already. Remember, we talked about that being an advantage, and it was a huge advantage. And once they cut off the Mississippi and went in and destroyed the Atlanta railroad hub, they had broken those lines, those few lines of railroads that were there for the South. So that was an effective strategy to break up that infrastructure. And they're breaking telegraph communications at the same time. Some surveillance innovations that are coming in are these balloons that they're creating. So they use them for surveillance, and you can see a picture of the balloon right there on the right-hand side that's called the Intrepid. They're using it to see where the troops are lining up, how many they have, where they're coming from, where they're digging in. These are great spy machines. One of the biggest improvements is the rifling that is used to improve the gun barrel. And if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, that spiral you see with clouds and sky in the background is looking through an AR-15. And that's those grooves that was put into the rifles in order to improve accuracy. And this is a leap in the accuracy of these guns. And so what that did was completely change the type of advancements they would make. Typically, they would line up and then just march towards one another. And even though they're shooting at each other, the accuracy is so bad that to a certain point, they didn't have to worry about losing too many men in these lined advancements. But once you have these improvements made to the rifles, it's just suicide to do these advancing ranks. So trench warfare starts coming into play here, because if you don't take cover, you're going to get shot. And anyone who's got a rifle within any kind of reasonable range is going to be able to target you. On the Navy side, no more wooden ships, okay? No more flimsy ships. Now they've got ironclad warships that they can use. And submarines are going to be used quite heavily by the South and by the North. But this technology is going to come into play, and a lot of innovations are going to go into that. Another interesting and very culturally impactful innovation at this time is photography. And Matthew Brady is known for his battlefield photography and the visual record of this war. At this time, all they did was recreate battle scenes through paintings and drawings. But once the photographs started coming in, this was shocking to Americans. I mean, they were looking at faces of people that they knew dead and bloodied on the battlefield. This had a huge impact on how Americans looked at war. Now you're noticing there's not drawings or paintings of these military leaders like the ones you saw in the previous slide. These are photographs of these generals. And also here on the right, in the right upper hand corner that's not in the banner, is Clara Barton. And she was a nurse during the Civil War, and she ends up being the founder of the American Red Cross. Last slide here, and we're going to wrap this up for this lesson about the Civil War. It's very obvious and became very obvious, especially because this was a war between brothers. You have Americans fighting Americans, brother fighting brother, son fighting father, and uncle fighting, his cousin on the opposite side. This was just so brutal and a heavy price to pay to having to fight this war. So biblically, Christ was always trying to tell you that if you have a conflict with your brother, you resolve it before you have to take it to the next level. Because every level you take it, whether it's through war or through the courts, the price you pay is just so high. And let me go ahead and read this quote from the Bible. "But I say unto you, that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. First be reconciled to thy brother, and then come and offer thy gift." So he's just basically saying, if you're going to be mad at your brother and for no reason, then you're going to answer to me. I'm God, and you're going to answer to me about it eventually. And second, don't come offer me your gifts of Thanksgiving, if you still have something hanging out there that's, a rift between you and your brother. And I don't just mean brothers. I mean people. You're talking about human to human. Okay, you need to reconcile these things before you come and celebrate with me. It's basically what this first paragraph is saying. "Agree with thine adversary quickly, whilst thou art in the way with him, lest at any time the adversary deliver thee to the judge, and the judge deliver thee to the officer, and thou be cast into prison." And basically what Christ is saying there is that you need to resolve these things. You don't just let them hang around. You take care of them while you're on the way to the court, and resolve them before you actually go into the court. Because once you get to the court, there's going to be a judgment. And once that judgment is made on this earth, you're going to be fined, possibly punished in a certain way, and cast into prison, possibly. So these are things that you solve before you hit the courtroom. You could see how the nation and the leaders of the nation were trying to work this out. That's what all those compromises were about. They tried to do this negotiation thing, but the South ends up getting too much political control, and it's going to end up being a very heavy price to pay for this disagreement. And the end of this quote is, "Verily I say unto thee, there shalt by no means come out thence till thou hast paid the uttermost farthing." And basically, you're just going to pay the highest price possible for not having reconciled with your brother. If you're going to take it as far as war, the price is going to be so heavy. And there is no worse battle than between two brothers of the same country. I mean, it just doesn't get any worse than a civil war. So the price that was paid here as a result of this war is that 620,000 men are going, and probably several women are going to die in this war. 1/3 of those that are fighting are going to be killed, wounded, or captured. And on each side, they're going to lose 1/4 of the troops. So 1 in 4 persons, 1 in 4 men fighting are not going to come back from this war. They're going to have died on one side or the other. This is the highest percentage of troop loss that America has ever suffered in any war. So you can understand, I mean, obviously it's all contained in America, so obviously there's going to be a high casualty rate. But this is the heavy price of war that Christ is talking about, when we could have settled it otherwise. Other things to take away from this lesson is that notice how cunning General Lee's strategies are. It's a great study to go into and look at his military strategy because it's so unconventional and not advised to split up your troops, but he always does this and was always successful in evading the Union. Now, on the other side, you have this performance of Grant, which is looked at as being very brutal, and it is. He's engaging in total warfare. He is involving destruction of civilians and their property. And it's going to leave a deep scar in the South. And really, even today, there is still that deep-seated resentment of the South against the North because they're not going to just suffer during this Civil War. This is going to take the South almost 100 years to recover from. And I think Lincoln demonstrates a lot of compassion in his second inaugural address when he knows the war is over, that they've gotten the upper hand now. It's just a matter of days before it's going to officially end. And in his second inaugural address, and he says, "But let us judge not, that we be not judged." He's trying to let the gas off, when with this oppression against the South. He doesn't want to just drive salt into the wound at this point. He's really trying to bring those states back into the fold, and it's going to be difficult. And so I believe that's why he's compelled to have this compassion and say, don't judge them. We're going to stop. The war is over. And we don't want them judging the way we have done our actions as well. And so compassion is going to be a huge component in bringing this nation back together again. And I think a very noble accomplishment is that the Emancipation Proclamation did free the slaves, and morality did prevail in this case at a very high price, yes. But in my opinion, Lincoln took the high road here, and he paid dearly for it. He's going to lose his life for the resentment that the South has for his actions. Slavery is wrong, and it was the right thing to do to fight this war in order to get the slaves freed. That's going to do it for the Civil War. Next time, we're going to take a look at what's going to happen the day after the Civil War is over. What is going to happen in America, and how is that all going to go down, and how are we going to pick up all of those pieces and put them all back together into one nation again. It's not going to be easy, but I think it was well worth the fight. Y'all have a fabulous afternoon, and I will see you next time in American History class at GW Bridge Academy.